All right, welcome everyone. Thank you for coming to today's discussion on the American Rescue Plan, the ARPA spending plan update. First, I'd like to recognize that Councilperson Erica Strausberger is here, and then for our budget panel here, I'd like to go through and have introductions. So, Peter, if you'd like to start us off.
Peter McDevitt, City Council Budget Director.
Rhea Price, Deputy Director, City Council Budget Office.
Jake Pollack, Director of the Office of Management and Budget.
Patrick Cornell, Deputy Director, Office of Management and Budget.
Then David.
Oh, and I believe we're joined on Zoom by Deputy or Assistant Director Dave Hutchinson as well. There you are, Dave.
Well, I guess it's a good thing I put everyone before me. That's a good practice, but I guess I should introduce myself. I'm Bobby Wilson. Represent District 1 on the north side, and today what we have in store is the ARPA update. Originally, whenever I was talking with council and the budget staff, continually just comes up about where we are with the ARPA spending. Everyone currently on council was a part of that process, and I think it'd be good for us and the public just to understand what's happening and what to look forward in the future. So with that, we have a slideshow presentation to go over. Yes. And whenever that's up, Peter, you can just start us off, because I think it's good to go over all the slides. And actually, as we're walking through the slides, feel free to director feel free to stop us at any point and kind of I don't want to say give your 2 cents, because we got a lot more money than that, but maybe give us some of your input on what you're seeing here. All right.
I have whole nickels for you, Councilman.
Whole nickels. Yeah. Okay. My kids think that's a lot of money.
Okay, so we put together this presentation, and thank you to OMB. A lot of this, the data in here came from the quarterly reports that Patrick worked very hard on. We would start with a broad overview. This is just a brief recap of what ARPA is. There's $1.9 trillion that the federal government. Yes?
And then you might just even pull the mic in closer. You gotta bite it.
But you can't expand that?
No, I tried. It doesn't show up on the TV.
Oh, it doesn't show up. Okay.
We're at the will of the technology. So ARPA, there's $1.9 trillion economic stimulus package. $350 billion of it went to states, municipalities, counties, tribes, and territories. And of that, the city got about $335 million. So we put together a little timeline of how it all rolled out. It started in March of 2021, and then May 2021, the federal government, the Treasury came out with interim final rules for how the ARPA money could be spent. We received our first tranche of money in June 30th of 2021. August 31st, we began quarterly reporting. And then January 2022, effective April 1st, was the final rules issued by the Treasury of how ARPA money could be spent. And then June 30th of this year, we received our second tranche of money.
If I could just quickly add, as it relates to the timeline, one additional note. Even as those interim rules and final rules were issued, Treasury has continued to provide updated supplementary guidance on a continual basis about the program, some of which has over time modified our understanding of some of the ways in which ARPA funds can be utilized. And we've had some discussion at this table over the course of the past year about minor changes that have been made to the plan to reflect that, either as identified in the final rule or the subsequent guidance. So I just sort of wanted to note for everyone's understanding that it seemingly has stabilized quite a bit now, but it has been a moving target, even beyond the dates listed here.
Yeah, that's an excellent point.
Are those rules, or are they guidance based on what they didn't like to see?
They issue guidance to further clarify language in the rules. So it's, think about the ways in which council might adopt an ordinance that calls for departments to then adopt policies and procedures, and the ordinance would be 5 pages and the policies and procedures could be 300, right? It's additional supplemental information for how to interpret the rule.
So a good way to kind of dive into that deeper is the Treasury Department released these 4 broad eligible use categories, and these are more like talking points than actual spending categories. It's just like a jumping off point for how we would talk about spending ARPA money, and then we dive a little deeper into the 7 expenditure categories that you see here. And one that I would like to point out, the infrastructure is primarily for water, wastewater, and broadband internet connection. So that's the infrastructure that they're referencing in those. And then just diving even deeper into it, this is pulled directly from those final rules.
I just want to clarify that chart in that comes from the interim final rule. I didn't place the expenditure categories from the final rule just because it's pretty lengthy. So, but that is directly taken from the interim final rule.
But just going back to what Director Pollack said, they do refine these and go deeper into detail to provide greater and greater guidance to municipalities like us on spending our money that we receive for ARPA. So just some general requirements. This is for spending ARPA. The money has to be obligated to be spent by the end of the year in 2024, and it must be fully spent by the end of the year in 2026. The ARPA spending plan under category 6.1 revenue replacement provision for services, which is where the most of what the city has budgeted its ARPA is for. It may not exceed a calculated revenue loss on a calendar year basis, and OMB works to calculate that number every year. It needs to be updated every year, correct? Yeah. Can't be used for debt service, deposits into pension funds, settlements and judgments, or to offset a tax cut or replenish reserves. And we talked about the quarterly reporting that OMB had just put out as a requirement, and also monitoring of subrecipients.
We talk about obligating, just expand that a little further, and what that technically means.
Effectively, the funds need to be under contract by the end of 2024, even if perhaps if we're thinking about some of the capital projects that have been placed in the ARPA plan, the actual construction might happen to occur in the spring of 2025 or be a long-term construction project that takes some time. But it can't just be budgeted and appropriated. It must also be firmly encumbered by a contract.
How about the URA? If we took all the money and gave it to the URA, everything that was left, would that be under contract?
Technically, it would be, I believe. We will get into this a little bit later. There are provisions in those individual contracts with the URA that allow for the opportunity to reallocate.
All right. Thanks. Just wanted to...
So we also wanted to talk about the temporary nature of ARPA funds. And it's really important best practice to follow when using ARPA money. It's important not to create new ongoing costs that are going to last beyond when we'll run out of ARPA money. They talk about how critical infrastructure is well suited due to the non-recurring nature. But we want to think really hard about investing in things like reopening swimming pools or recreation centers that weren't open currently and would require ongoing operating costs throughout the future. So we already have issues staffing pools and rec centers, and if we continue to open even more, like, we have to make sure that we know how we're going to pay for those ongoing operating costs beyond the time frame that we have to spend ARPA funding on.
You see it?
Yes, absolutely. And just to comment on the way in which that has manifested itself in the current spending plan. As Pete mentioned, revenue recovery is an eligible expenditure. So a portion of our ARPA expenditures are supporting existing city positions. The rationale for that is that they were positions that were temporarily in jeopardy of needing to be eliminated because of the sort of one-time revenue drop that happened during COVID, and ARPA is allowing us to sort of bridge that gap as revenues recover to be able to fully capture those positions back into the operating budget, which our current sort of 5-year forecast and the 5-year spending plan that's in Mayor Gainey's preliminary budget shows will occur before the deadline. So we're able to reabsorb all of those operating costs back into the general fund by the end of 2024. Anywhere where, as part of that budget, which is not necessarily the topic for today, where we're proposing new spending on positions, that new spending would begin in the general fund and carry forward in a balanced nature through the entire 5-year forecast. So we're not in jeopardy of sort of the exact scenario that Pete's cautioning against there. We are, of course, also allocating significant ARPA funds to capital projects, which meet the criteria very cleanly because they are constructed and then done. And they are for already operational facilities. So the ongoing cost of operating those facilities is already baked in. It's just the capital improvements that are being captured here. And then in some of the transfers to the URA or other agencies, they're either one-time costs or programs we envision might continue after ARPA with other funds if they prove successful during this period, but which are not operating in nature. They could sunset if the money runs out and we don't have other funds to carry them forward. It's our hope that won't be the case, at least in some of them, but we have that flexibility. So I think I think, again, Pete's spot on in this analysis, and I think the plan we have at the moment reflects these imperatives.
Okay. Yeah, I should mention that right now I'm just asking questions, but I open it up to other members that are here. I'd like to keep it going maybe till the end to get some some deeper comments or more deeper questions, or some questions that maybe you came with, but feel free to stop and ask a question. But I would like to get through all the slides though, so just be mindful of that.
How many slides are there? 24, and we have about 40 minutes left. All right.
So next I want to dive into the city specifically and their ARPA plan. As I mentioned earlier, we had about $335 million, and we received it in those two tranches last year and this year, and that just kind of outlays right there. And all this can also be found in the operating budget, the 4 years and how well it's budgeted throughout those 4 years. And then this is just a little bit of a deeper dive into how the city budgeted the ARPA funding in accordance with those 7 expenditure categories outlined by the Treasury. And I will note, I talked to Rhea about this earlier, some of the expenditures in category 6.1, the revenue replacement, a lot of that is going towards the URA, so it will be moved to category 2.34, the negative economic impacts.
I can comment on that real fast. As we finalized the URA contracts and agreements, we had them tapped into 6.1 revenue replacement, but a lot of those projects do have clear indications of negative economic impact because of COVID-19. So as those contracts finalize and as each quarterly spending plan that I submit to Treasury is updated, some of these might shift up into a 2 point something for negative economic impact.
I just want to add that some of the expenditure categories, they require additional reporting, and so 2.34, that is one of those categories. 6.1, there is no additional reporting required for that, but yeah, I just wanted to note that.
Councilman Wilson? I didn't know if we could just jump in with questions, or, for the sake of getting through the slides, I'll keep it brief, just a couple quick ones that I had on the introductions there. So let me just make sure it's $335 million of ARPA funds, half of which was received last year, the other half is going to be received this year.
It has been received.
It has
earlier
been
this
received.
year.
Okay, so we have the funds in total. Okay, and Mr. Pollock, you said the funds have to be under contract by 2024.
The end of
The
2024.
end of 2024. How much of those funds are under contract?
We will get to that.
Oh, we will get to
Yeah.
that. Okay. The other thing was, you said it can be put toward revenue recovery, such as the parking tax, such as,
No, for a different reason.
okay.
Revenue recovery is one of the categories, but the parking tax specifically because the parking asset is obligated to the pension fund, and one of the prohibited categories of allocation is to supplement a pension asset. That one does not apply.
Okay, I'll withhold any further questions until we get further along. Thanks.
I did want to clarify one thing that was said when you're talking about moving it from section 6.1 to 3.
2.34.
Okay, so yeah, from
It might be simpler to use the
What is it?
tags. They're currently under lost revenue, and they would
revenue.
move to negative economic impact.
negative economic impact, where you said most of that would then go to the URA.
Well, I think, sorry, just to clarify
Pass
that,
through the URA or to the URA for those positions within the URA?
they're not for positions.
Okay.
It's the same projects and expenditures that are already in the plan. So think the OWN PGH program or other programs like that. What the actual money is being expended on doesn't change. As the agreements with the URA to move those funds to them to administer those programs are finalized, in the course of finalizing those agreements and in the URA adopting its policies and procedures for those new programs, we sometimes identify that that additional documentation provides a rationale to report it under a different category. It doesn't change the nature of the expenditure at all. It's how we do the Treasury compliance.
Okay, thank you. That was all I was curious about. Thank you.
I also wanted to follow up on the URA question. Typically, all our allocations to the URA are done by reimbursement, so the CDBGs, et cetera, and we had some discussion about this when we first did the ARPA allocations, including the city controller. So my question is, in these new agreements with URA, are we actually deducting the $75 million from our trust fund and moving it to the URA, or is it going to be done as per usual on a reimbursement level so that they disperse the money and then we backfill it?
It's being done essentially on a reimbursement basis, but with an initial, basically working capital frontage so that they can begin administering the programs with an initial upfront infusion of cash and then charge reimbursements back against that so that the funds will move to them on a reimbursement basis, but with a bit of frontage.
Is there a percentage of frontage?
It's different for each program.
So about net of the 75 million.
We have not, right now there is one invoice pending, and it's also done as invoiced by the URA, so we're not just moving the money immediately. Right now, I have reviewed an invoice for an initial $500,000, and that is the only one so far. It's as each contract comes up.
But so only $500,000 has left the city's trust fund of ARPA, the ARPA trust fund?
For the URA, no. There was one completed invoice for one project for $100,000.
And the frontage has not left the trust fund yet?
No.
Okay, so, and I do ask, just for the record, and then I'll let us continue, that as I've said, when we've had other discussions at the table, it's really council's job to make sure that we meet these deadlines. And so that's why we're having these post agendas, which we're grateful for, so that we can say, like, hey, if this one's not moving fast enough, not that it's not a great program, but we can move it towards the same social outcomes through whatever medium we need, right? And so we really want to be sure that we know kind of which funds are moving and which funds are moving maybe faster than expected. And so maybe there's more need in the community for those funds.
Yeah, I think that's what we were kind of talking about. Like initially stopped the one slide about obligated. And so how does this, like the word obligation,
So, and in,
like fit into this whole
I'm sorry,
conversation?
Councilman. In Pat's answer to that question, which was related here as well, in addition to the reimbursement basis that's included in the contracts, they also include subrecipient reporting. So we're seeing from the URA how the funds are being expended and provisions to take the money back if it's not moving.
It's great. How do
So-
we see that?
They are clearly indicated in the contracts, which the controller, I believe, has put up on Open Book Pittsburgh.
Awesome.
It is in a strict term, if, and this is what I was alluding to earlier, if, I believe it's April 1st, 2024, the city will reevaluate what the actual status of the project is, and at that time, we have the right to reallocate.
I think we're going to be looking to monitor that well before 18 months from now.
That's
So-
the last
So
point.
maybe
at which-
so we don't have a slide on that.
We do.
Okay. Anyway, I was going to say that'd be a great slide in the future.
Yeah.
But yeah, to continually get that
Maybe
update.
we don't need the slides. Let's just talk.
You want to talk?
We'll give you some jumping off points. And here's just another a visual of a breakdown of how the city has allocated the ARPA money. And you can see over half of it is going towards operating money on a day-to-day basis for the city. And here's a further breakdown, a closer look of those operating expenditures. And I'll note that over 60% of this, and this kind of goes back to something that Director Pollack noted, went towards eliminating anticipated workforce reductions, which is a good reminder of where we were at a couple of years ago. We expected that we were just going to have to cut a ton of positions. So the majority of that operating money, which is the majority of all of our ARPA money, went towards reducing that offset. And here's just a little progress report on it.
This just before we move on. No, I'll come back to it. Yeah, we're good.
This is the same information, but we're showing you what we budgeted, what we spent of that, and the amount remaining for each of those categories.
I'll just very quickly note that as this is, supporting day-to-day operations, salaries, and things of that nature, we're under, as you would expect, on target to expend all of these funds on schedule because we knew the costs heading into the allocation plan pretty precisely. So no concerns in our ability to expend these funds on time.
And if I may also, these allocations for the operating budget are worked into the operating budget revenue forecast each year through 2024 with Director Gula. Oh, now Director Gula. That's exciting.
Question on this while we're on operating budget. How do we reconcile then the tension between the ARPA funds, disappearing after 2024 and, our 5-year forecast, or 5-year plan, operating budget positions that are, like, say, restoration of non-personnel. Oh, sorry, that's non-personnel. Restore some vacant positions, right? Some that will persist beyond that period. How do we reconcile that?
They're included in the forecast. So
Yeah.
the forecast shows the ARPA funds entering the budget and then disappearing at the end of 2024. And the current 5-year forecast shows that when that shift occurs at the end of 24, based on projected revenue recovery over the next 2 years, the general fund will be able to sustain all of these operating costs by then. It would not have been able to do so last year or this year or in some of the intervening years without the support of ARPA as that bridge. But acting as a bridge, it pushed the hit of those returning to the general fund out to a point at which the general fund can sustain them. So it's serving its exact purpose in that instance.
And it looks like the vast majority are not new positions or not, additional positions. It's
None of the ARPA supported positions are new. They were either scheduled for elimination or had already been cut as revenues deteriorated under COVID. But any new positions being proposed will start in the general fund so as to not produce that problem.
okay. Thank you.
So next, moving on, here's a breakdown of the almost $60 million budgeted for city capital projects. And here's just another visual of those same projects and the progress we've made in obligating and spending the money on those capital projects. It's important to note that due to the nature of capital projects, and we've talked about this a little bit already, it does take longer to spend capital money. You have to. It's a long process from planning it to designing to constructing everything. So these do take a little bit longer to spend. And then here is a list of all the $70 million budgeted for URA projects. And kind of going back to the questions that you had, Councilwoman Gross, here is the progress we've made in actually obligating, because City Council has passed legislation to allow us to enter into the contract, but we haven't entered into contracts for all of it yet. So it's technically not even obligated because the contracts aren't all in place. But and here's you can see the $100,000 that Patrick was referencing that has actually been spent.
Very few cities are 100% obligated, right? And so they didn't even pass the kind of preliminary budgets that we did in the first summer. And it's one of the reasons I objected to our kind of quick budgeting. And so I've got a report in front of me that I'd be happy to share you all that tracks the spending in our 14 benchmark cities that my staff were gracious to compare. And it has pie charts for each of the cities so that we can see the distributions. Because I just wanted to follow up on your point that the capital budgets are the slowest projects. And we are one of the 14 benchmark cities in the nation that have our preliminary budget most heavily on capital projects, right? And so that these are relief funds. They were meant for things like homeless shelters. They were meant for things like temporary housing. They were meant for things like childcare and food, the kinds of social infrastructure that the Biden administration hasn't otherwise been able to, we're hoping they'll be able to provide cities. And that these funds, other cities are using these funds that way. Shorter term, yes. Alleviating the stress on neighborhoods because of COVID, absolutely. Emergency relief, absolutely. And so there are ways so don't be too stressed. There are other ways we can do capital projects. And if we need to spend these ARPA funds sooner, there are ways that other cities are providing models for reinvesting in communities, but with tighter timelines.
Yeah, well, you definitely jumped ahead. I was going to talk about how, what's that? Yeah, but, big point of this is to talk about those capital projects that we've allocated. So that's actually was the number one thing that kind of drove this was, a lot of the neighborhoods are asking, about these capital projects and what, where they're at, and not really even seeing like the design and architecture on their contract yet and all that. So that's all good stuff.
Yeah. I think largely the overview that was just provided there is correct. First of all, starting with, it is true that capital projects as compared to operating activities have a longer lead time, right? There's preliminary design, there's planning, design, bidding, and then construction. So it's not unusual or unexpected that these projects, while they are all advancing, have not drawn significantly against their allocations yet, and we anticipate that we'll see a market uptick in that as currently allocated into next year when more of them reach construction phase. So that's true. It is also true that the spending plan that was adopted last year does have a large number of capital projects in them, meaning that a great deal of capital projects were started at the same time, and that in turn does mean that to some degree they compete with each other for bandwidth, and that also leads to some of the timing, or to your point, Councilman, ways in which designs haven't been vetted by the community yet. That work is ongoing because the funds are there and obligated, but in many cases they haven't gotten there yet. We have, including a few times this year, asked council and appreciate council's authorization to make minor modifications to some of those capital projects, moving funds to already shovel-ready projects that had a funding gap. And where we do so, I actually think in most of those cases, it's been in instances where the original budget for a project was greater than what now appears to be the necessary costs after design is completed. So we've reshuffled in a few of those instances to close gaps on a few projects. We do intend, when Mayor Gainey has formally introduced his budget, to make or to request other similar minor adjustments to some of the projects. In many of those cases, that's reflecting that those projects, while still, again, moving forward, are on a timeline that will move past 2024 into 2025 or 2026. And in those instances, basically keep those, to the point you were making, Councilwoman, keep those projects whole by funding those out years with bond, pay-go, or other forms of capital funding, which then does create some slack in the ARPA allocation. Our request will show that as going to shovel-ready capital projects to keep it within the context of the capital budget, but that's, you've hit an important topic and one that we'll be discussing a lot through the end of the year.
Okay, moving forward, these are the remaining budgeted expenditures that don't fall into the capital or URA categories that we had talked about. And the one that I wanted to note, there's $17.5 million going towards lead line replacement and wastewater lateral replacement going to PWSA. So that's kind of calls back to the infrastructure projects that we had outlined much earlier. And here's a progress report for those projects. Okay, moving on. The overall status of the funds to date, based on which, again, thank you for the compliance report OMB put together. The total amount obligated, $118 million. Of that, $85 million, almost $86 million, has actually been spent out the door. So that leaves about $216 million that still needs to be obligated and then spent. Alternative spending plans. We've talked about this a little bit. Patrick had mentioned understanding the timing requirements to obligate and spend the money, the ARPA funding. The administration will work with council to reallocate any unobligated funding by April 1st, 2024.
Come up with a top 10 list.
Yeah, I mean, we're not at that point yet. You know, I obviously the April 1st, 2024 date is part of the establishing the established adoptions. I imagine that we'll have, again, there are some instances, as I said, where we are proposing small adjustments this year, and then I think I would say by 6 months into fiscal 23, at that point we'll have, I think, an actionable picture on which, in the instance of, again, on the operating side, I don't anticipate anything major changing there. On the capital and the outside subrecipient side, you know, we'll be far enough along into those project executions, while at the same time close enough to the deadline to make some of those.
What is the number one easiest way to spend ARPA funding? Is it just through the operating?
Well, in operating, it is the fastest way to spend the money, but the scope of what we can spend it on is basically already all captured because it is not new positions, right?
So you have to calculate, if you can remind me, maybe we covered this, but whatever we're filling with the operating gap, there's rules around, okay, you had to calculate out how much, like percentage-wise, you were going to lose.
That's essentially correct. Yeah. So we're already kind of at that maximum operating spend. It's what goes quickest, but it's also...
So it's not like we could just say, well, we're just going to fund our whole operating budget.
We couldn't, and even if we could, I would strongly not recommend it because it would make fiscal year 2025 pretty brutal. So so we're not going to go that direction. You know...
But other than operating, is there like a second bucket that's just...
You know, this is an area where there's understandable disagreement. From the simple point of view of expenditure, right, of rapid expenditure, I would say that otherwise shovel-ready capital projects that may have a cost overrun due to inflation and the increased cost of materials and construction would be the fastest, right? Now, there's quick and then there's impactful, which I think is what Councilwoman Gross is raising, understandably. But to answer your direct question about speed, that would be the fastest way behind operating to get dollars out the door.
Yeah. Councilwoman Gross?
Thank you. Right, so I'm going to wave some more of these pie charts around, just as an example. Baltimore got about twice as much money as we did, right? 641 million. And that big green slice of the pie is public health, right? Now, they have a health department and we don't. But you can include under those kind of expenditures things like immunization offices, funding for telehealth infrastructure for the city, food insecurity. Sorry, we were just talking about that. Home delivery, grocery boxes, grab-and-go meals for seniors, people with disabilities, vulnerable residents, and also funding for the additional staff, right, to protect seniors and the disabled communities. And there are many examples like that in that category in other cities. Charlotte, North Carolina got about a third of what we got, right? But they've got 25% of their revenue in housing. So it's different than a city capital budget. And under housing, we see responses like responses to homelessness, homeless shelters, right? Where we are funding the kinds of things that we've been struggling to fund otherwise, right? That we know are really needs that our citizens are experiencing that otherwise we're kind of scrambling around looking for the money to do. And so it is different than this council voted. I didn't vote to support the current budget, but the ARPA budget, in the summer of 2021. But this is, we're also nearly 3 years into the pandemic and our needs are changing, right? And so we maybe at that time didn't anticipate that we'd still be in this pandemic and our citizens would still be incurring these needs, right? And so here in Cincinnati, there was $3 million for a nonprofit emergency shelter housing, and $6.4 million to the Affordable Housing Trust Fund, right? So there are 14 different cities that we typically in my office compare ourselves to that are typical, Pittsburgh benchmark cities, and the important part is that all of these cities keep reevaluating where they are now and where their citizens are now. And so they're reevaluating their allocations. So that's the second time I'll make that point, so I'll stop making it, but I appreciate the time.
Do we have one more? Two? Just one. Yeah, let's go through a couple more.
So on that topic, I would imagine that your staff got a lot of that information from the Brookings Institute, where we pulled this information from. This is the breakdown of how other metros, this is as of March 2022, are spending their money.
But thank you. A variety of sources, but I don't like that to compare us to metros because our allocation was for municipal, and we're not a metro area.
It is a good point. This is how it breaks down in those 7 different spending categories. Similar to the city, the majority of it goes to government operations, but as you mentioned, there are several other categories that get large chunks of the expenditures. So next we had some questions about the ARPA plans, and
I guess these are actually my questions.
oh yeah.
Did we just threw in a slide and act like they were his questions?
Do you want to read them, or do you want me to just answer them?
You can just answer them. So.
Sure. The first question, just to sort of read it out, is: has the law department reviewed the spending plan, projects, and contracts to confirm legality and compliance? The answer to that question is both yes, but also that it's an ongoing project. Kristen Erickson in the law department is law's primary lead, who works closely and regularly with Patrick on continuous review. We also have an outside accounting firm, Mardusel, advising us on this, and so the representatives from Mardusel, Law, and OMB are in regular communication about the plan, the project status, the agreements, contracts, invoices, right? That's an ongoing and continuous compliance process, but there are no major sort of concerns at present, right? That review process and our diligence about compliance is in part the reason why a number of the contracts the agreements, I should say, while they are close to being finalized, have not yet been fully executed, but they are, again, very close. And it was through that process that we identified, as I mentioned earlier, as the final rule, and then some of the supplementary guidance as it related to the final rule was rolled out over the course of the past year. Some of the changes that we brought to council on an interim basis this year, including shifting funds to the Bridge Asset Management Trust Fund, were driven by a clear understanding that perhaps some of the originally scheduled allocations were ineligible. So where those issues are identified, we've already acted to address them, and council has approved those changes, and we'll continue to do that if and when new issues of that nature arise. But at present, no concerns there. Pat, do you want to add anything to that?
Just with respect to some of the URA contracts, the URA board has approved several sets of guidelines for projects that just makes it one step closer to full execution. And beyond that, looking at the lists of the URA projects, most, if not all of them, we're going back and forth with legal counsel to iron out all the details.
So the second question is administration confident the capital and URA projects will be completed by December 31, 2026, considering supply chain and workforce challenges? I think I've already spoken to that in part.
Yeah.
We continuously review that. There are, again, embedded in our proposed capital budget some minor tweaks to that regard, and I think more will come over the course of FY23. So we continually monitor for that, and there aren't clear indications necessarily of major issues, but we continue to track that. And then finally, can the administration provide a list of projects that may be considered under the alternative spending plan? I wouldn't say that we have a list of projects. I would say that the purpose of that is, as enshrined in the original authorization, that we continue this monitoring. And as we've just spoken about, there are a variety of ways in which funds that become available could be expended. When you say, as phrased by the question, that could take the form of capital projects. If that were the ultimate consensus, I would only strongly suggest that they be projects that are, as I've said a few times, shovel ready so that the funds could move quickly rather than initiating new projects, because I don't think we could likely initiate new projects and get through the entire planning, design, and construction process starting today and have them done in time on an ARPA basis. But then again, as Councilwoman Gross has mentioned, there are other opportunities as well.
Yeah, given that we went through some of this through,
Yeah.
Taking a break during the slide and talking about it. If I was to revise this question, I would then ask, are there certain time points or deadlines that you all have on your side that, are time points like this is when we should have this conversation? Because, if we don't do this now, then...
Sure. Being that the original allocation was adopted and the projects were already advancing before the beginning of this fiscal year, we've taken the presumption that, we would only shift funds away from an already authorized and advancing project if it weren't going to be done in time. And that being the case, I would say our internal checkpoint on that is around the end of the second quarter of fiscal year 2023. That will be the point at which it will be, I think, sufficiently clear which projects are falling behind. That's a limited. I mean, there are presumptions there about, the existing list of projects continuing to move forward. That's obviously something that is the subject of a wider conversation as we discuss this fiscal 23 capital budget. But under the parameters of the already established, 5-year plan, ARPA allocation plan, capital improvement plan, that would be the right juncture.
I'm glad we got through the slides. I want to go around to members, and starting with Councilperson Strasburger, if you had questions for the panel.
Thank you.
Mike's not
Thank you, Councilman, and for chairing this meeting, this post-agenda hearing, and for all of you for your informative presentation and for providing, these supplementary materials. I guess my question is, since our initial ARPA budget and allocation was approved and has been adjusted a couple of times, or at least once formally, the Congress has passed the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act and the Inflation Reduction Act. I realize that those might not have the same kind of direct benefit to cities in the same way that ARPA has, but knowing what you know about those bills and the implementation of them, is there anything that you foresee shifting around to accommodate for one that might fit a project better and have a longer timeline versus ARPA, which will run out by the end of 2024?
It's a very good question. The majority of the funding opportunities available to cities and municipalities in the two pieces of federal legislation you mentioned come in the form of competitive grants, which would either apply to a federal agency or to PennDOT as the federal pass-through. Because there's no direct sort of formula funding or direct allocation, we'd have to be successful in securing a grant in order to guarantee those funds would be available, and then potentially at that point look to reposition. We are aggressively pursuing grant opportunities produced by those pieces of legislation. In many cases, where we can, we are pursuing grants to support active projects. As feel like I've said at this table 100 times this year, the budgets that existed for many of these projects when the ARPA plan was adopted, or when the fiscal 22 capital budget was adopted, was about 3 months before a major increase in inflation, and so the cost of most projects has accelerated pretty dramatically. So where available, we're seeking grant funds to close that gap and keep a project moving with our existing allocation and use that for the overage. But there are components, particularly of the Infrastructure and Jobs Act, that produce new types of funding for new types of projects that previously had not been federally funded, and thus we didn't have projects in the queue in that way. So in those instances, we are exploring applications for new projects. It's pretty early days in that. We're mostly exploring the act and the programs as their guidelines or their notice of availability of funds are released. Notice of funding availability, excuse me, and then trying to match that to projects or needs.
If I could add on to that as well, one example of a project in the ARPA plan that is going to directly tie in is the Hill District Corridor Enhancement line that is going to work directly in tandem with the RAISE grant that was recently received. Mm-hmm. So there are opportunities for that, and as Director Pollack said, the grants office is keeping tabs on all of these new NOFOs as they come through.
It's a very busy time of year for them too.
I'm sure it's going to be a fluid situation over the next year or so as we determine what projects are moving forward as expected, which ones are held up, which ones we need to then reallocate from to another faster moving allocation opportunity, and which other grants we succeed in winning, and then money can be shifted elsewhere. So, but I'm glad to know that we're aggressively going after those competitive bids. So, thank you. That's all I had.
Councilwoman Gross?
First.
Yeah, if you don't mind, I just have a pressing meeting. But thank you, Councilman Wilson, for holding us. The more information I can get on ARPA funds, the better. And thank you all for being here. I really appreciate it. I noticed $17.5 million towards PWSA. Is that all lead line replacement? How's that divided?
So 17 million of that has been executed in a contract for lead line remediation. One of the major components of the American Rescue Plan is that water infrastructure. And then that remaining 500,000 is targeted for wastewater lateral repair and replacement.
Okay.
That one, if I could just speak a bit more about that one. That is a pilot program that PWSA has developed to assist homeowners, low-income homeowners, who've had their wastewater lateral, their sewer lateral collapse, and don't have the funds to pay for a repair, which is frequently the cause of all kinds of complications for them and their neighbors. It can cause damage to the right-of-way. It can cause their home to become not occupiable because they don't have sewage service, but frequently they don't have the ability to pay, and many homeowners are not aware that they own their sewage lateral until it breaks. So this has been an issue that's been plaguing the city for decades as we have aging infrastructure. You of course can get insurance for your lateral, but that's an emerging market, and so a lot of people don't have it. This would be a pilot program to assist homeowners without the ability to pay for the repair to execute a repair and hopefully address some of those. And the goal there would be that if it's successful, that there might be ways to fund that into the future, or for PWSA to fund that into the future.
No, when you talk about that, you're talking about the whole entirety of the money, or are you just talking about 500,000?
No, that's just 500,000.
Just 500,000.
The 17
okay.
million was for is as
Yeah.
Patrick said
Yeah.
for lead line replacement.
Okay, so thank you for clarifying that. Which brings me to, I feel it my duty to let the public know, and you all know, that PWSA doesn't do lead line replacement in my district. I have a different water company, I have Pan American. So I just always feel my duty to say, when we have $17 million of ARPA money going into some project or projects, that my district doesn't benefit from it, just to be clear. We will have to deal with Pan American on our end. So I never fail to mention that. I feel kind of, I wish we could allocate more money towards the sewer collapse, like you say. And then I would feel a little bit more like, oh, okay, well, we have sewers, and PWSA is responsible for our sewer lines. So I feel like maybe we could adjust that number a bit, because is that all the money you think you would need for that, or across the city, or? It's
a pilot. No, I mean, the scope of that issue is certainly greater. It's an entirely new project for a public agency to take that kind of work on when it's privately owned infrastructure, and not something that PWSA is eligible to spend ratepayer money on because they don't own the asset. That's why this outside funding was necessary. I too, I'm keenly aware of this issue from having worked at PWSA for a time, and the struggle that it produces when there's really no one to pick up the bill, frankly, for a project like this. So I'd like to see it stood up and become successful. And assuming that success, I would certainly like to work with PWSA, who would ultimately be the recipient of the funds, to identify other sources into the future. To your question about reallocation, the 17 million for lead line replacement is already executed under contract. So that one's done.
Okay, so that answers my question, that we don't have the flexibility, because we're already under contract to move. If we wanted to move $3 million of that towards sewer encavements, we don't have that flexibility because we're under contract.
That's right, as it relates to the 17 million.
So I need to tell my district that we're getting a possible piece of that 500,000 for our sewers, and that's all we're getting from that $17.5 million, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. I'll try to say that in the most positive manner to my district, but it doesn't always go over so well, I will tell you, because we have other needs, of course. The other thing you touched on, Jake, was capital projects. If you'd have told me that we'd be sitting here today with the Public Works Division, we know the supply chain has affected that by years. How firm, I guess my assumption is that the September of 26th is a firm deadline, meaning if we do not have that project complete, we lose the money. Is that right?
Sorry, could you just say the ending again?
September 26th is the deadline for projects complete. December of 2026.
Sorry, yeah, it's December of 2026 is when all the funds have to be expended. They must be under contract 2 years before that.
Right,
yeah.
Right. And to that, I just want to say, with supply chains, so if we have a big capital project, it's a $10 million project, and if the supply chain doesn't come, if there's problems with the supply chain and we don't finish it, that is a firm date, correct? It is gone then. Even though we might be under contract with a capital project, if we don't have it finished by 26, what happens? I mean, if we're under contract in next year, and we don't get the thing finished, blame supply chains just for now, what happens? I mean, we're under contract, we have this money allocated out there, and what would happen? Would the government still seize that money or take that money back? We would lose it?
The answer is unclear. I imagine what we would do right now, right, pending if there were further guidance from Treasury as we get closer to that date, this answer might change drastically. But I think we would, as a city, still want to complete the projects. We would just have to massively pivot the existing capital budget for that particular year.
Okay. Okay, well, I wish there weren't a timeline. Obviously, all the other municipalities are under the same timeline, I would guess, correct?
Yes.
And it's an extraordinary amount of money to allocate and to find where to spend it. And my fear is, like, we move too fast because we're forced to move fast on this. When we're talking about $335 million, I feel like and I'll just give you a brief example. Councilwoman Gross brings it up all the time. She had people in here just last week and she was showing me her charts about food security, for instance. I noticed that most other cities have something allocated toward that. We do not, and I don't know if it's just a matter of moving too fast or do we not feel it's important enough. But when I see $17 million of this money going into a different district, well, food security would benefit my district, I would tell you. So I hate to know that $17 million is under contract already, because I'd like to think there's wiggle or playroom there where we can actually get, whether it's food security or collapsed sores, funds back to my district in that manner. But so I understand it's a tough job to do to allocate this money. It's not easy spending $335 million, I know. But to know that whether it's supply chain or whatever, that we lose that money, that's kind of a scary thought. So we really have to be on the ball and pushing, whether it's a contractor or supply chain issues. We really have to keep our eye on that. And the other thing, again, like I said, the food security, I didn't see anything in ours. We have nothing allocated towards that, correct?
No, the allocation plan, as it was adopted last year, didn't include that. And to date, we've not proposed a change that would do that.
Okay, maybe we could shift the money around where my district can benefit more, since we're not getting any of that $17 million, all right? So in other avenues, I would hope it's easier for me to go to my district and say, here's how we're spending the ARPA money, when I show them $17 million going to PWSA and we're getting nothing in return. It's a tough sale for me, So I hope you'll understand that, and maybe we can make some provisions to make people of the 4th District happy. That's it for me. Thanks again. I appreciate you all being here. Thank you, Councilman Wilson.
No problem. Councilwoman?
Thank you, appreciate it. And so I do have a couple of things. One of them is a follow-up, I think, to this idea that the most recent federal funds are competitive grants, so it's not only the Inflation Reduction Act. Each one of the federal departments has been putting out a lot of money on the streets to cities, especially, and we're grateful to the Biden administration. But we have to apply for them, right? And so we talked about this, I think, earlier in the year. I remember Director Pollack being at the table, and I said, I'm concerned that we don't have enough people in our grants office, right? This is a very unusual, once-in-a-generation time for the federal government to be putting out this much money into American cities. And so we shouldn't just expect the same staff to be able to do triple the work. And we should be staffing out the seeking of grants to match our city's needs, whether it's things that we are able to currently budget for or things that we've never been able to budget for, that we know our needs and that we've been unable to budget for at the table. So it almost feels like there needs to be a grants, in the operating chart, a grants person in each of the major city services departments. So not just a grants manager in DOMI, which is, again, sufficient before this historic moment, in OMB, but maybe a grants manager in DOMI or a grants manager in city planning or a grants manager in DPW, so that they're more subject matter experts, right? I appreciate, because I've worked with our grants office, how well they do in understanding so many different functions of city government. But because the Biden administration is putting money out through USDA, and then the next day putting money out through the Small Business Administration, and then a month later putting money out through the Federal Department of Transportation. Those are very different subject matter skill sets. And so I am wondering if you can spend just a minute speaking to kind of your current operating budget proposal, since it's ongoing, and how we might better make sure that we're not missing out on these competitive opportunities.
So this was appropriated in the fiscal year 2022 budget, but it actually came into fruition this year. The team in the grants office has grown to now be a staff of 3, with the third staff member being a post-award, essentially compliance and reporting manager, which is a major work. Exactly. That saves a lot of work for the other 2 grants officers who were both seeking, identifying the funding opportunities, working with departments to prepare the applications, submitting them, and then doing the post-award reporting. We've now got a dedicated specialist on that, which has dramatically freed up the other 2 grants officers' time to pursue new opportunities. And they do that in consultation with subject matter experts in the departments. So I think their work is largely on, having a clear understanding of what the pipeline looks like, identifying those opportunities, as you've mentioned, and then socializing that with the folks at the departmental level who can identify projects. And again, the expertise they bring is more on understanding the flow of funds process than the project types. I actually think that we have a pain point along the lines of what you're talking about in securing grants, but it's more project management capacity within the departments that execute. So within DOMI, within DPW, in particular, other places as well. What we need is larger teams of capable project managers to actually be in that flow in identifying the projects and the funds and executing. And we are proposing numerous positions of that type in the mayor's operating budget for that reason. So I would say, totally agree with the spirit of your comment. We may be executing it in a slightly different form, but aiming in the same place, absolutely.
Or needing, those are both pain points, honestly. And the pain points are also going to hold up your capital projects. That's what you're talking about.
Yeah. I mean, a grant fund, for the most part, these large federally funded grant projects are for capital projects. So whether they're spending city capital dollars, bond and pay-go, or whether they're spending grant funds, it is still project execution.
But we shouldn't be operating like this money's going to keep flowing forever, because it isn't.
That's right.
So, we shouldn't worry about over-applying, even though we also need, as you rightfully point out, to increase our org chart with those project managers who can do the implementation. But this is fortuitous. And I bring it up specifically around ARPA because I remember the conversation at this table a year ago that these ARPA funds were going to be the only funds for cities. Well, that's not true. There have been new federal funds, but it still won't go on forever. And that some of those new federal programs are specifically pointed at the kinds of capital projects that legacy cities like Pittsburgh have, like the wastewater fundings that is specific and additional to the ARPA funding, like the lead water service line project that we're so grateful that the Biden EPA is looking at and supportive of. But it's also true of infrastructure like broadband, right? And other kinds of utility work that like bridges and roads, right? And so there is a lot of moving parts at this time. And one additional person in the grants office is a good start. I don't know that I would think that's enough. So that was one part of my question. But just to follow up on Councilman Coghill's point about the kind of public health section of the ARPA spending, which Pittsburgh's pie chart is very skinny on our public health utilization. That also was meant to be what cities did with this funding. We had the public hearing about testifying for a food justice fund, which would be not only for food security for today, but also putting in place the kinds of small business infrastructure that supports food security tomorrow. So I also do think it's a longer term investment, which I heard very well that council members wanted to not just spend the ARPA funds on money that would be like gone immediately and not be able to see long lasting impact. And I think that the Food Justice Fund, properly structured, could do both. So it's about hunger relief, absolutely, which in Councilman Coghill's district, we know that the poorest households are not just under affordable housing pressure and rent pressure, but also food and childcare. And those three combine to put our families in very precarious situations to the point that they lose their housing. And we talk a lot about here at the table about how to reinvest in communities. What can we do for our kids across the city? Well, what we can do is make sure that their moms can pay their bills, keep their housing, and feed them, right? And that is something that we have the capacity to do a lot better than we're doing now. And so this is not the only time I will be talking about it, but I wanted to be sure not to fail to mention it today in the discussion about ARPA funding. And I will definitely be talking to the administration more about that soon. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. I just had a couple questions and just kind of like an idea for like a follow-up update post agenda on this. And happy to collaborate on when the best time to have that would be, just to put that out there. So I noticed in the operating slide, you put in the OCHS AHM project. That's at 10 million that we allocated. When I looked deeper into it, I think we worked together on this. There was 5 million that has to be basically, I don't know, under contract before the end of the year, and if not, that means we would have to reallocate that. I'm bringing this up because it's, Councilperson Gross, you bring up a good point about the public health aspect, and I think that was, front and center of our minds when we were allocating these funds, specifically to the understanding that this program would address issues relating to homelessness and really, eviction, primarily homelessness, and then also the alternative response. And so we were having other briefings previously, and this is a constant topic of conversation about how to address certain different public health concerns and larger societal problems. And really this was a program initially, when I saw it, was a way that we could really partner with the county big time to really make sure that we're doing the bulk of the work appropriately on the ground with outreach workers and connecting them to the available housing. As we see, housing is not available, so that's obviously an issue on the back end there. But specifically to this allocation, is there an update on this? Because this is, I'm just concerned that as we move forward to the end of the year, that this may not, there might be some issues, and we might have to reallocate it.
Sure. So you are 100% correct in that the way that it moved through the operating budget is as in the general fund. So what we would need to be able to encumber those funds and move them into future budget years is legislation and an executed contract. If we have legislation before the end of the year, which I expect to happen, we will be able to then hold on to those funds and move them to continue that program as it moves through. Chief Frank and Laura Jagowski and our partners at AHN are working through the finer details of the contract now.
So it is possible that it would be under contract by the end of the year, the $5 million?
Yes.
For AHN?
Yes.
And the reason why I think it says OCHS AHN is because it's actually under the OCHS operating.
Yeah,
budget.
They're the responsible department for administering the contract, so that's why it's listed under them. But
I'm glad we're taking this time because those two get interchanged too frequently to distinguish. But
just as DOMI might hold a contract with a paving company to do the paving, OCHS is the unit of city government that would hold the contract with OCHS. That's why it's described that way in the documentation.
Well, that's great news if we're reaching closer to getting that contract under.
I'd like to add also too that, just because that particular aspect of the project and the contract hasn't moved fully forward, AHN is working with our community development team. They have ESG CV funding that is still active and still ongoing.
So the scope of work.
Right, that's how they're currently being funded, is through
Correct.
emergency
Correct.
service grants.
Correct.
Yeah. Oh, were you going to say?
I was going to say the same thing.
All right. The other just note that I was curious about was the streetlights. We had voted for the streetlights, and I see this in the capital projects as here and not spent yet. And I was made aware that there was I think we talked maybe about it at some point. That basically went back out to
right.
bid, separate it. Yeah.
The original bid was RFP. Essentially, we discovered upon law department review earlier this year would have created a design build contract, which as a municipality we're not permitted to do. So we revoked the prior award and bid out the design and construction management services for the work under one contract, which has been awarded. And I don't recall off the top of my head the status of the second bid for construction, but that initial award allowed for the beginning work on.
So we'll see that back I guess we'll see that contract back at council here soon.
Yes.
Okay, great.
But in any event, because it's in the capital budget, there's no concern about an end of the year rollover. It'll just remain in the capital budget until the contract's ready to be awarded. So that one's
Okay.
on track and moving ahead.
Okay. I don't want to belabor each individual project, so I'll just make a general kind of statement about what I'd really like to see in terms of an update, and I think I'd like to collaborate, especially with everyone that showed up today, all council members, kind of just put this together initially so we can just all get on the same page. It was great to hear from everyone, and I just think it'd be good for us to stay together on this. The overarching thing that I'm just would really like to see a visual of is really just all capital projects, or even some of these operating, as much as we can fit into nice visual of like bars that will show where we are in the project. Basically, let's say Cali Rec Center. So you got the Cali Rec Center. I would mention the fourth division, but that's not in ARPA funds, right? But essentially just, where the projects are and maybe some notes around it, like the breaking points on where we would, fill in the gaps with bond money, move ARPA funds, just so we can really, each of us can really understand it, especially for our districts and our community. But to that effect also, are the costs rising, and do we have to put more funds into it? Because when I look at Cali Rec Center, it was like, I think there was a total of $7 million or $8 million allocated at the time. The only capital project that I was a part of was a playground. So, and the community sees that dollar and it's really high. It's a big amount of money. Obviously, buildings cost a lot of money. But just as we move forward with the timeline, I think that's just the whole conversation we're talking about. It's just like, when do we just offload? When do we completely change directions?
Sure.
Yeah. So a nice visual. I mean, we'll work it up and we can.
Yeah. Happy to provide that or work to provide it. We'll have to pull together information from a variety of sources, so it might take a little time, but we can work to assemble those. To your question about projects being over budget, the point at which we typically know that with a fair degree of certainty is when the designs come back, and then when we actually bid the construction and we get the bids back, whether they've come back higher than when anticipated. So in the case of a project where we don't yet have those designs, we won't know, whether it's now over budget or not until we reach that checkpoint. I do anticipate that we will discover that in these projects only because we have reached that same point in many other projects over the course of this year due to inflation, and that's why we have come, again, only in one or two instances as it related to ARPA, but in many other projects that are in the capital budget. We have a shovel-ready project ready to go to construction, except it has a funding gap, and so that's where we've been moving funds around to keep them moving.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, initially I'm thinking or recommending that we would bring the director of DOMI and director of DPW, and I'm not sure how far it would go, or we just fit it into another post agenda, but it would be good to even just get a further peel back the onion of hear directly from the director on what the challenges are of just capital projects in general right now to fit that in as well.
I also think there's going to be opportunity to discuss that in the context of the hearings to adopt the budget over the rest of the year, as well as another point at which, the
Yeah.
status of some of those
Yeah, definitely.
projects can be discussed.
All right, great. Councilwoman Gross?
Thank you. It occurs to me to ask something I didn't ask before when I was listening to your answer, Director, which is that sometimes after we've done design and we go out to bid, we find out that there's not a lot of capacity in the private sector to reply to those RFPs, right? Are you seeing anything there? Are you seeing anything thematically, even in advance of, us doing our budget hearings with the individual departments? Is there anything you're seeing in the market? And again, just a reminder to the public that we don't build our own things mostly. And we could build our own things. We used to build our own things, but we mostly don't build our own things anymore. We get the idea for them, we get the money for them, and then we hire a subcontractor.
Yeah, I wouldn't say that I've noticed or identified any overarching trends there. We do occasionally put something out to bid and get fewer responses than we expected, but nothing that I could pin down for you today as a trend around that at the moment. There is a clear trend around cost escalation, as I was saying, but not around responses. But I can certainly check with Chief Procurement Officer Olzinger.
Yes, I appreciate that. A learning lesson that we've had at the authorities and in the city at this table over the last 8 years is that it was helpful to pre-qualify companies, right? And so you've come in under that system where we have kind of pre-approved vendors, so we don't have to vet a vendor fresh with every single project because we've vetted the vendors and we know that their individual capacities. And that allowed the departments or the authorities, we certainly learned this going from almost no capital plan at PWSA to gigantic capital plans of rebuilding the water system almost entirely, that we were able to put out each project or proposal kind of quickly and at smaller bites, so that we got the more vendors to the table, especially the smaller minority and women-owned vendors that we were striving to get. And it really helped having those pre-qualified firms so that we could see what the skill sets were. So we didn't have to just put out these giant blanket project proposals that only a couple of very large firms could respond to or not respond to. And it really helped in that pipeline. And you lived through some of that while you were at PWSA as well. So.
And we are very much still in that practice and utilize the pre-qualified program extensively. I think that there are, again, continual lessons being learned there and about using it in a way that addresses exactly what you're talking about, Councilwoman, which is the ability to kind of have a robust list in advance and take off bite-sized chunks. I think that there may be some instances where we become a little over-reliant on it because of its expediency, and where we might we're exploring some new criteria around when to more concrete criteria, I should say, as to when we use an ITQ versus a full bid to ensure minority subcontractor participation at rates that match our goals and things of that nature. So. Or
just bringing some work in-house, like we also did
yes.
PWSA with lead and light replacement, and we've done even in little bits and bites here at DOMI with being able to do, I think, our own thermoplastic finally. Are we doing our own thermoplastic, for example? And we used to only subcontract out for that, and so it really helps us deploy projects faster.
We've been doing that with the construction division in DPW increasingly over the course of the year as well, and are proposing again, funds for a multi-year process of bringing bridge maintenance back in-house for the same reason.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Yeah, just real quickly, I wanted to add something to what Councilwoman Gross had said. I'm a builder. I'm a general contractor. I am registered to take the lead safety course that I think Councilwoman Wilson and Councilwoman Strasburger initiated. Oh, you're taking it as well?
No.
Oh, you were part of. Oh, you're part of the problem. I'm joking about that. I think it's great. I wish everybody would take it, but I could tell you just from it being in the industry, contractors, general contractors, they'd rather not work in the city of Pittsburgh, and for many reasons, not just because of having to take the lead safety course, just a lot of red tape, whether it's seeking out the permits and things you need. I wonder, and I will check this, I guess. I'm scheduled to take the class November 29th, I believe, before my license expires. But if a general contractor does not follow through with that, I have a feeling it's going to be a high rate that doesn't do it. I mean, it's a 9-hour day for me. I take off. Are we not going to, I mean, if PLI does not submit that license to them because they didn't take, say, just this course, just for one example, are we not going to do business with them anymore? I mean, because I do feel that contractors shy away from the city. There are certain few that do business with the city on a regular basis, and they're used to kind of jumping through the hoops, but, you know.
Yeah.
So,
Well,
go ahead.
Director Kinter would have to give you the exhaustive answer to that one.
Can she give me a permission slip to get out of it for the day?
Man,
Definitely
it
not.
wouldn't be a council meeting if you
Yeah,
weren't
definitely
going to
not.
harp on
I
it.
support it, I do. I am actually looking forward to it, just not the 9-hour day. That's all.
I would just clarify briefly that it's a requirement in order to pull a permit, not just to do work with the city. So that doesn't just mean our procurement or city
The
projects
lead safety course is a
Yeah.
requirement to pull a permit?
of certain residential types, yeah.
Oh,
That might involve interacting with lead. So.
okay.
All right. Anything else? No. All right. This meeting is adjourned.